Hello, it's Lucas Catton back with another installment of the Narconon and Scientology Chronicles. And for this episode, we are going to be talking about Narconon's insurance fraud. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about some of the stuff that sort of led up to this. But there were a few things, and one of them was the fact that as the economy started to dip in 2008, 2009, Narconon prior to that was primarily, actually only, a cash pay program. So people who came in would either finance it through one of the facilities, or they would finance it through outside places, and get sometimes bank loans or put it on their credit cards, whatever. And it was roughly $30,000, which honestly for treatment is for a private treatment center, $30,000 is pretty typical for a residential stay. It's expensive, yes, but it wasn't overly expensive, and they were roughly 3 months long. So in terms of the cost, I know some people are shocked to hear about $30,000, but I know plenty of programs, excellent programs, that charge about $30,000 for 30 days. That's the cost of living. I mean, if you go into a hospital for 30 days, you're well over hundred or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that aside, prior to all that, it was mostly a cash pay program. And as the economy took a downturn, their enrollments started to dip as well. And so they had to figure out something else. And most other treatment programs out there would accept insurance as a form of payment. But Narconon is, and was, still is, in this sort of difficult spot to where they don't provide what is considered standard treatment practices in order to bill insurance for. So they had contacted some insurance billing people and worked with some other facilities and some other people that were sort of in the network and sort of not. And they pieced together what they thought was an acceptable billing strategy. And during this time, they wound up committing quite a bit of fraud. And this is not just my opinion. It's not just hearsay. This actually came from actual investigators who review the documents from insurance companies and from Narconon centers and other reports that they received. And so they went from billing zero insurance to getting millions of dollars in insurance revenue in just the span of a couple years. It was pretty quick. And it was from one center to another. It wasn't just like a single center that was doing this. Oklahoma was doing it, Narconon Arrowhead, Narconon Georgia was doing it. Well, that went pretty much under the radar for quite a bit until this string of deaths happened. And one of the lawsuits was Narconon Georgia and a wrongful death suit there. And in the discovery process, they also had some other people come forward, and they found out that there was fraudulent billing charges from Narconon of Georgia. Well, in April of 2013, state and county agencies in Georgia raided Narconon Georgia and seized all their computers and their billing records and patient records, their files. And they went through them all. And shortly after that, investigators from Oklahoma called me. And I wrote about this in my book, Reconnection. But investigators from Oklahoma called me, and they wanted to meet. So they flew out to Georgia and met with me in May of 2013. Pretty sure it was May of 2013. And I had an initial meeting with them. They wanted to know lots of information because they were going to continue to pursue, because the raid on Narconon Georgia produced quite a bit of information that was then, they're like, oh my gosh, we found, for example, there was this insurance hat write-up that Gary Smith from Narconon Arrowhead had provided to Mary Reeser at Narconon of Georgia and other Narconon centers. And hat write-up in Scientology terms is like kind of like a job description or a manual on how to do something for a particular job or position, that kind of thing. So they had gotten this insurance hat write-up and started distributing it to other Narconon centers. Well, Narconon of Georgia was very, even more poorly run than most of the other centers. And they found out that they were billing for people who were no longer there. Just kept on sending bills. And shortly after that meeting, I was called into another meeting in Georgia at a government building in Atlanta, in downtown Atlanta. And present there were the insurance fraud investigators who had conducted the raid and were going through all the documents and files, and the Oklahoma insurance fraud investigators who came back out to meet with them and me. And also they brought in someone from the FBI. Because as they continued to uncover stuff, and in this meeting, they confirmed that they found multiple counts of verified fraud. This isn't an allegation. This was them confirming that they found multiple instances of verified fraud, that they were figuring out how to be able to pursue with that and how to charge people or the organizations, etc. Meanwhile, Narconon knew they were in extremely hot water, to say the least, and somehow their attorneys negotiated a non-prosecutorial agreement with I think it was Gwinnett County District Attorney Danny Porter. So Narconon of Georgia shut down. In the agreement, it said they were going to shut down for at least 2 years and then abide by state rules if they ever reopen. They've never filed and never reopened since then. This was back in 2013. So it's been, more than 7 years since then. But as they were going through this, they were upset because the insurance fraud investigators were like, that wasn't an agreement that we were on board with, but the DA's office did that. So as they would continue to uncover stuff, and as they started sharing information with Oklahoma about the fraud occurring at Narconon Arrowhead, they wanted to figure out a strategy on how to be able to pursue charges that were worth their time and effort. Because as they contacted some of these insurance companies, some of the insurance companies are like, look, there's much bigger cases of insurance fraud that we're more interested in getting that money back. Narconon was still, in their eyes, a small player, but it's still millions of dollars of insurance fraud that had occurred. And I'll explain some of the ways that they did that. One of them I mentioned at Georgia, for example, the investigators had said that they found notes where they had a note where they dropped the guy off at a bus stop or something, the former client, but yet continued to send bills for the next however many days or weeks afterwards, and then received money for those bills, for those insurance claims. And then the insurance company went back and said, hey, can we see the records? And then they went back and falsified records and sent them back to the insurance company. They created false records and sent them back to the insurance company. So it wasn't just like, oops, I'm sorry, we made a clerical error. This was knowing willful fraud. Like, ridiculous. Like, people should have gone to jail. So the difficulty that Georgia had was that there were so many people that had their fingers in it, they didn't know exactly who to charge with what. And it eventually died out because they had to charge an individual, and the various people who were there all had some kind of finger pointing thing, and no, it was him or her, etc. And they ultimately declined to do that because also some of the insurance companies that they wanted cooperation from didn't want to pursue getting their money back. So they wanted to go, like I said, after other larger fish in there who had more millions of dollars to go after. But they brought in the FBI because they needed the FBI to do a multi-jurisdictional investigation, and we're getting ready to do so. And we're speaking to multiple assistant U.S. attorneys in order to do this. Meanwhile, Oklahoma continued on their investigation, and they came close. They'd asked me to draw up a schematic of the facility of Narconon Arrowhead. They wanted to know exactly where various records were kept. They knew that there was fraud being committed, and that they knew that there was, in Oklahoma, since it was a much larger facility, over the course of a few years, tens of millions of dollars worth of insurance fraud that was likely. One of the statements made in that meeting was that as they did a review of the program, because they weren't set up or licensed properly for all of the various things that they were doing, that every single claim should have been fraudulent. So for years, millions and millions of dollars of paid out claims that in this investigator's mouth, every single one was fraudulent. So they turned it over to the state attorney general. Unfortunately, the assistant U.S. attorneys, for whatever reason, is unknown, because I never had a follow-up meeting with that FBI agent or There was a couple phone calls with another FBI agent in Michigan, but I don't know where the FBI investigation ended. In Oklahoma, they wound up getting to a grand jury, and the grand jury's time ran out. So they began the investigation, and then they released a statement that they didn't have enough time, that they encouraged the state to continue investigating, and eventually it fizzled out because, again, they felt they had bigger fish to fry elsewhere. But these investigators that were involved were furious because they didn't understand why, with all these millions and millions of dollars of insurance fraudulent claims, that they were being let off the hook. And it was interesting because as you talked about, or as we talked about in one of the earlier videos about the Oklahoma's history with Narconon and Scientology and their early on lawsuits and how they tried to get licensed and couldn't, and then decided on something else, and then CARF, etc. So there was all this murky water of what they could and couldn't do. So here's the specific way that they were filing fraudulent claims. Insurance companies require licensed therapists to be the ones directly delivering and or supervising or overseeing the delivery of counseling services in these behavioral health facilities. Narconon doesn't believe in hiring them. They won't hire them. Anyone who has been hired in that capacity isn't doing what they're claiming to do, because they're delivering Narconon, which is not licensed therapy. So every claim for residential treatment, for example, that was including therapeutic services that were supposedly acceptable among the insurance requirements, were fraudulent because they didn't have somebody who was a licensed therapist actually overseeing any of the delivery. They didn't believe in it. So that was like the main thing. But there were other things that other treatment centers were also guilty of back then, which is you might get a single license for residential treatment, and then eventually the number of authorized days for residential treatment stop, and they require someone to step down into a lower level of care, such as what's called PHP, or partial hospitalization, or they step down into IOP, or intensive outpatient is what it's called. And so they then started billing, like as the denial started coming in for residential, they just went ahead and started submitting claims for lower levels of care, even though they weren't actually delivering lower levels of care. They were still delivering residential treatment. They're still living on site, doing the exact same things and all that stuff. So they weren't meeting the requirements that way either. They were just trying to get as much money out of a particular policy as they could. Narconon wasn't alone in that. There are many treatment centers who used to do that, and insurance companies cracked down on that and unfortunately swung too far to where it's been very difficult for some people, in order to get reimbursement for actual services delivered within the guidelines for people who need help. And it should come back somewhere to the middle soon, to where insurance pays for valid therapy delivered. And for people who need help, they pay the high premiums for this coverage, either individually or through their work. They deserve to have that coverage. That just should be the way it is. And this is speaking from also a former facility owner, and I work as a consultant with other treatment centers. So I understand the process much more intimately now, even than I did back in 2013 when I was talking with these prosecutors and investigators. So that's the story. So think about how many Narconon centers there used to be back in 2013 before a bunch shut down and a bunch changed and did something else or left the network or that kind of thing. How many tens of millions of dollars were billed to insurance companies fraudulently back then, and they were getting away with it? And think about today, those that are left. Narconon Arrowhead is still actually open, believe it or not. I don't know if they charge insurance today or not. Maybe they've scaled it back to only charging insurance for the drug-free withdrawal portion, which is the only portion they're actually licensed for from the state of Oklahoma. I don't know. Narconon Suncoast in Florida, maybe they're billing insurance. Probably I'm sure they've learned from the previous mistakes and figured out a way to cover it up some other some other way. But I do know this: they can't be delivering valid therapy in the eyes of insurance companies and deliver the Narconon program, because they're not in the same book. They're just not in the same realm. Narconon Fresh Start out in California, Nevada, and South Texas. Like, these guys are still around. They're still doing something. Assumingly, they're still billing insurance and accepting it. But during this time, that 2013 era, 2014, when these investigations were hot and heavy, there were multiple states on it. There was FBI on it. There was, assistant U.S. attorneys on it. There was a lot of attention, and it's unfortunate because they found actual crimes and failed to prosecute. That's all I got for this time. Until next time, we'll have another interesting story from the Narconon and Scientology Chronicles. Take care.